Hey guys, today we are going to be talking about the Canon EOS R6. Before we get into the video, I want to show you some footage that I shot internally with this camera on a family vacation, just so you can see what to expect if you weren't attaching it to a small rig setup like this. I hope that you guys liked that video. Again, I shot it internally with the IPB H.265 codec, and honestly I didn't have too hard of a time editing that footage, but I'll get into that a little bit later. In the video I tried to add a little bit of everything that you can get from this camera, so I shot in all of the different 4K modes, 4K 24, 30, and 60, and I also shot in 1080 120 frames per second. I also took a couple of short time-lapse videos with the camera, and for me those turned out to be pretty usable, but I did have some issues using that feature and the interval shooting feature, so I'll talk about that a little bit later. Since I made that first impressions video of the Canon EOS R6, I've utilized this camera on a few different paid gigs, and that includes both video and photo sessions. So I feel like I've gotten a really good idea of what this camera is capable of. There's some things that I'm still confused about, but for the most part, if you want a kind of a quick summary on my thoughts on the camera, I think that this is a super capable camera and worth the money for sure. And that's coming from someone that hates buying cameras full price when they first come out. All right, so let's talk about the build quality first. So this camera feels really good in the hand, and the first thing that kind of stuck out to me was it's pretty big. Like the grip's big. It's a substantial grip, and I wasn't expecting that. I have bigger hands, so I find that to be a pro to this camera, but I imagine people with smaller hands might not find this as comfortable and might prefer the size of the R and the RP more. In terms of weather sealing, if you look at how Canon's marketing this camera, they just kind of say that it's in line with their 6D series cameras, and that the R5 is in line with the 5D series cameras, which I find to be not very helpful in determining how much bad weather this can handle. But I did read somewhere that the weather sealing on this camera is sort of on par with the Canon EOS R. So for light rain, I really don't have an issue taking this out without a cover or anything. But obviously if it's downpouring or if it's snowing really hard, I'm probably just going to cover this up with a plastic bag or some kind of camera cover just to be safe. Again, the ergonomics for this camera I really love. I love the joystick instead of the touch bar. Even though I wasn't super opposed to the touch bar, the joystick is just a little bit more natural feeling. I think I would have liked the touch bar on the EOS R if it was a little bit more responsive, but it was just a little bit clunky and slow to use, so I never wanted to use it. I also really like the little scroll dial right here. I really like that feature when I'm showing clients photos or if I'm just going through photos myself. Overall, I think that the feeling of this camera is pretty lightweight. Not when you attach something like the 85 1.2 lens on there, but the camera body itself feels pretty lightweight. It doesn't feel as solid as the Canon EOS R though, and I imagine the R5 too. You can definitely tell that it's more plasticky than the R and the R5, and even though it's lighter, I probably would prefer the build quality of the R and the R5 on this camera. But overall, like I said, it's kind of nice, especially if I'm going backpacking to save on weight a little bit. One more thing about the build quality, the shutter life on this camera is rated to be 300,000 shutter actuations, which I think is really good for a camera at this price point. So I think it's cool that at this price point you're really getting that professional grade durability that you would expect from, you know, a professional DSLR or mirrorless camera. But that also makes it even crazier to think that the R5 is rated to last for 500,000 shutter actuations, which I think is awesome. Moving on to image quality, this is the section that I think most photographers are going to be interested about. I know a lot of people are wondering if moving from 30 megapixels on the EOS R to 20 megapixels on the R6 is going to make a really big difference. And from my own personal experience, no, it hasn't really at all. And the file sizes are a lot easier to manage too. Unless you're punching into the files like 200 and 300%, you're really not going to notice, and your clients are definitely not going to notice unless they're really in tune with high resolution files and they're putting the picture on like a large wall or billboard. That being said, I am only using RF glass. I don't have any EF glass, so I don't know if that really makes a difference on whether 30 versus 20 megapixels is really going to make a big difference, but I suspect it won't. One more thing about image quality, the files on the Canon EOS R6 tend to come out warmer than on the Canon EOS R, and I found this both with photos and video. And for photos, it's not really too big of a deal just because if you're working with raw photos, it's easier to match the pictures to the Canon EOS R files within Lightroom. But with video, I found it a little bit harder to match the color to the Canon EOS R files in Final Cut and Premiere. And that might just be because I'm newer to video, but it's something that I've struggled with. That's not to say that the files look bad, it's just that the color science is a little bit different. But the overall quality of the 4K video in the Canon EOS R6 is definitely way ahead of the Canon EOS R, just because it's downsampling from that 5K footage. That's definitely a big plus for this camera. Okay, so moving on to usability for this camera, I don't really think that I would need much else in a photo camera to be happy. The camera really does have everything I would need for professional work, like the 12 frames per second. The last photo session that I did with a family, I actually stuck it into 8 frames per second just because I didn't want to deal with the pain of editing through all of those photos afterwards. So I don't really know when I'm gonna need 12 frames per second, but it is nice to have. Maybe if I ever get that RF 100 to 500 lens, I might stick it into 12 frames per second when I'm shooting wildlife, but besides that, yeah, I don't know. I was trying to think about if there were any situations in which I would want to utilize my Canon EOS R that I'm shooting on right now over the R6. And initially I thought like, oh, maybe landscape work would be good just because I'd have the extra 10 megapixels to use in post-production, but even then, I think that the awesome IBIS in the R6 paired with the better dynamic range makes me want to grab this camera instead of the Canon EOS R for backpacking trips or landscape focused work. Just because I find that not needing to carry a tripod and take the time to set that up when I'm taking landscape photos is way more valuable to me than 10 extra megapixels. Of course, that's not going to be the same for everyone, and there are definitely times when using a tripod is going to be necessary, like for astrophotography or if you are doing HDR stacking and stuff like that. The dynamic range on the R6 is awesome. Here's a photo of a high contrast scene where I didn't have access to any external lighting and I needed to really push the shadows in post. And I found that the dynamic range was sufficient for that scenario, which is a really extreme scenario. This camera kind of behaves a lot like the D750 that I used to have, in that I like to underexpose it and then bring up the shadows afterward if I don't have access to external lighting. I would say that the dynamic range is on par with the Nikon and the Sony cameras that are out now. And like I mentioned in my first impressions video, the eye autofocus, both for people and animals, is spot on, and I haven't had any issues that other people have had where the focus is kind of hunting back and forth. So that's been really great for me. Another thing about the buffer on this camera that I actually like over the R5 is that if you're using a fast UHS-2 SD card, you're not likely to reach that buffer limit. So you can, even if you're shooting at 12 frames per second, you are probably not going to reach the limit, which is awesome. All right, now moving on to overheating, which initially when this camera came out was the primary focus for a lot of YouTubers, but from what I found shooting with the firmware 1.1.1, I haven't run into any overheating, and I've used this on 2 separate photo shoots that lasted over 2 hours, and that's not to say I was recording for 2 hours straight, but I was recording for the majority of that 2 hours in 4K 24 frames per second, and I had no issues with overheating. Now, that being said, I was using an external monitor with the camera, so that could have something to do with it, but the video that I showed you of the footage on my family vacation, that was shot all internally, and again, I didn't have any issues with overheating. I never even got an overheating warning, so that is all good news for me and potentially you if you're thinking about picking up this camera as a hybrid shooter. There was one instance where when I first got the camera, I was just trying to test out the overheating, and I went outside and it was probably around, I don't know, 80 degrees out, and I was just shooting in 4K 60 frames per second with an external monitor, and after about 30 minutes of shooting on and off, I did get a warning, but you know, it never overheated, and the recovery times were pretty reasonable too. So okay, so one more thing about the usability of this camera, and that is editing with the internal files from this camera. So all of that footage from the family vacation was shot internally with the IPB H.265 codec, and when I was editing in Final Cut Pro, it really wasn't too challenging. I expected there to be more lag, but it only kind of cropped up here and there, so it wasn't bad. It might have been a different story if I was editing in Adobe Premiere. I'm not too sure, but I am editing on a 2016 MacBook Pro, 15-inch. So yeah, overall, I was happy to see that it wasn't too hard to edit the internal footage. But even then, I could have just transcoded those into proxy files to edit with. Okay, just some quick thoughts about some of the things that I feel like I still am looking for in terms of features as a growing professional. that this camera is lacking, and one being a full-sized HDMI port. So this camera uses a micro HDMI. I believe it's a micro HDMI, but it really is flimsy. I'm definitely going to look into getting that small rig attachment that locks it into the camera so it isn't accidentally knocked out during one of my video shoots. I do wish that you could dual record to 2 separate memory cards with this camera, or even if I was recording with my external monitor, I wish that I could also record video to one of the SD cards on this camera. And I think it's something that you can do on the R5, but for some reason you can't do it on this camera, which kind of sucks. I did have some trouble trying to figure out the interval shooting feature on this camera. While the time-lapse feature is pretty straightforward, you just set your camera into the video mode up here and then go to time-lapse and then just set up all of your different settings in that menu. While I tried to do the same thing with the interval shooting camera in one of the photo settings, I tried both mechanical and the electronic shutter, and on both settings, when I was trying to take pictures, the camera would blink like it was taking a picture, but nothing would actually record to the SD card. I'm sure it is user errors. If anybody out there knows why I'm having this issue, please let me know, but I can't figure out how to make that interval shooting setting work. So if I were to take a guess, maybe it has something to do with the way I have the camera writing to the card slots, but I'll have to play around with it more. I just wish it was a little bit easier to use and set up, and I didn't have to sort of do trial and error. Also, one note about the time-lapse feature is that I couldn't figure out how to make it go to an auto exposure setting. When I was taking that time-lapse of the sunrise, you'll see that the exposure just stays consistent and it ends up kind of blowing out everything. But even when I set it onto auto exposure each frame, which is what they call it in the camera menu, it still doesn't expose for each frame. Again, any experienced Canon time-lapse users out there, if you know how to work around those issues, let me know. Okay, so I'll end this video with some closing thoughts about the camera. If you are a Canon EOS R user and you're on the fence about upgrading, I would say that if you use your camera for professional work, the upgrade is definitely worth it. If you're just photography and video is just kind of a hobby for you, and you're finding that the Canon EOS R really does everything you need it to, you can probably just wait until the price of the camera drops later next year to buy it. On the topic of overheating, it hasn't been an issue for me. That's not to say that it won't be for you, but it might be something where you want to rent the camera just to see if it's going to work for you. One thing I wasn't expecting from this camera is that the files that are coming out of this camera, for me, are coming out a little bit warmer than I expected, so it is a little bit of a pain to try to match the camera files from the two cameras, but it's not a super big deal. But overall, I would say that the Canon EOS R6 is an amazing camera, even if you're paying full price for it. I will leave you guys with some photos from the Canon EOS R6, and I'll catch you in the next video.